The 1956 children's story 101 Dalmatians is a classic adventure of courage, tenacity, and smarts prevailing against the evil dog skinner Cruella de Vil and her equally nominatively determined henchmen. But you already know that. The book is hugely popular and spawned multiple animated and live-action adaptations over the years. Some of these even got sequels and spin-offs. But none of those sequels ever saw fit to adapt the actual book sequel, 1967's The Starlight Barking. And you can hardly blame them from a commercial point of view. The Starlight Barking goes from the first book's animals on an adventure plot to off-the-wall sci-fi, from a story that is at least vaguely grounded to one where the characters can literally fly, and from a simple narrative of parents trying to save their children to what can only be described as a plot centered around a single philosophical question, with the added flavour of thought control, murderous ideation, and biting political satire about the Labour government of the 1960s. So let's walk you through the plot, such that there is one. The story opens an unspecified time after the original. The puppies have grown up, but none of the dogs have died of old age, so probably a couple of years. At Hell Hall, the former site of Cruella de Vil's puppy farming operation that now has been taken over by the Dearlys as their new home, where they live with many of the 101 Dalmatians. As in the first book, Pongo is again our main point of view, and the story starts with him waking one morning in the dog days of summer and musing about his life, and how despite being warm, fed, and surrounded by his family and his loving humans, he still feels something is missing, perhaps adventure or being young again, a feeling he quickly feels embarrassed about and tries to suppress. So far, so normal, but then the weird stuff starts. Pongo wakes up to discover that he has slept in massively, and so has everyone else. He gradually wakes up the other dogs, then attempts to wake up the Dearlys, but they cannot be woken. There are other strange things. All the doors seem to have been left unlocked, and are conveniently blown open by the wind when the dogs approach, and none of the dogs are hungry or scared. Pongo and his wife Mrs., Perdita in the films, which is confusing as that's an entirely different character in the books, head over to the nearby farm to see the General, the old English sheepdog from the first book. They discover that it's not just humans that are asleep, but everything that isn't a dog. It's then that they hear the barking of their daughter Cadpig, the runt of the litter from the first book, who has since gone on to be the dog of the Prime Minister. And yes, this is where the political stuff starts, but there's too much of it, so I'll do it separately after I've gone through the plot. Cadpig lives in London, 60 miles away, so the dogs are confused at first, but it turns out she is communicating through thought waves. She's calling all dogs to London in this way, and asks Pongo to come too, to advise her strategically. If this sounds ominous, it is. Cadpig says she may form a private army commanded by her father, for which we shall need plenty of our own breed. More on that after the plot, because Cadpig has discovered something else, the swoosh, where instead of walking, dogs can hover slightly off the ground and move by means of thought at speeds of up to 30 miles an hour. By this means, Pongo and Mrs. form a corps of Dalmatians from Hell Hall and set off for London. When they get there, they find the city full of dogs that have answered Cadpig's summons. But again, there is no panic, no fear. All the dogs seem weirdly calm. The Dalmatians are taken to 10 Downing Street and meet Cadpig and her cabinet, made up of all the dogs of the human cabinet ministers. There follows a slew of political jokes and commentary which went way over my head as a child, culminating in Pongo issuing the groundbreaking advice that they should wait and see, which all the dogs seem very happy about. One name notably absent from this story so far is Cruella de Vil. She has been mentioned several times. Pongo heard that she has returned to England after being forced to flee the country after the events of the first book, and the Dalmatians wonder whether she could be involved in the mysterious goings-on somehow. This culminates when the General, the Major, Cruella de Vil's cat, and Tommy show up on a flying tractor. The latter three, though a cat, and a human child, are awake because they were previously made honorary dogs. Cruella de Vil's cat wants to go and find Cruella, who is in London, and frighten her. And frighten here is very much a euphemism. The cat is backed up by Mrs. and the Dalmatians' old ally, a Staffordshire Terrier from the first book. Pongo quite reasonably points out that Cruella has naught to do with what's going on, but he quickly finds that public opinion is against him, and off they all go to Cruella de Vil's house, only to find that she too is asleep, so they leave without killing her. After this failed side quest, they're back to waiting and seeing, until Pongo feels a sudden need to turn on the TV. When he does, it shows a blinding white light that speaks to Pongo, Mrs. and Cadpig, with each dog hearing the words in the voice of their owners. The voice tells the Dalmatians that they need to get all dogs all over the country to wide open spaces at midnight, where they can see the sky. All London dogs are to go to Trafalgar Square. The voice is somewhat sinister. It seems to be mocking them. It gives each of them a question to ask, but doesn't answer any of them, and it threatens them after they start theorizing about what the voice is. Still, the Dalmatians all decide to obey it, and when they get to Trafalgar Square at midnight, they all begin to feel very happy, hopeful, all thinking about how great they are and how everything is going to be fine. This builds and builds into a boundless collective bliss. Then Big Ben strikes midnight and all the stars go out. The dogs go from absolute ecstasy to absolute terror, and Pongo realizes as he regains his senses that the dogs are all being controlled by an outside entity. A light appears, becoming a blazing white star, which speaks with the voice from the TV. It reveals itself to be Sirius, the dog star, and says that it has come to take all the dogs away with it to outer space, where they will live in a state of perpetual bliss. It is Sirius the dog star that put the humans to sleep, that opens doors for the dogs when they need them, and that has been controlling their minds the whole day to keep them happy and calm and well. The dog star wants them to come with it to space, but says they have to go willingly. The last fifth of the book is then about this decision, the dogs and Sirius debating whether they should go. Eventually, the decision is put down to Pongo and Pongo alone, and he decides to stay. Sirius is sad but honours Pongo's decision and leaves, giving the dogs till dawn to get back to their homes before all the humans wake up and everything goes back to normal. The Dalmatians make it back just in time, and as he settles down in his bed, Pongo reflects that whereas before he had been hankering for adventure, now he is very glad that it is over, and appreciates what he has all the more. So that's the plot, distilled to 2 pages of A4, and already you can see why this is such a strange sequel to 101 Dalmatians. Yes, that book has sentient, intelligent animals, but that's a fairly routine feature of children's stories, and follows a usual pattern where humans are unaware of animal sentience, and the world at large is exactly like our own. Indeed, the narration holds that this simply is our world, and that dogs in our world are as smart as the ones in the book. Starlight Barking, on the other hand, introduces what basically amounts to magic, and the idea that Sirius, the star, is actually affiliated with dogs in some way, and is also alive and possessed of immense supernatural power. The stakes are very different as well. In 101 Dalmatians, the kidnapping of the puppies means that we always know what the peril is. There is a ticking clock element in that the puppies could be skinned at any moment. The threat is real and immediate and understandable, and when they escape, they are constantly at threat of freezing to death, starving, or being caught by Cruella or other hostile humans. In Starlight Barking, by contrast, the threat is unknown for the majority of the book, and so the peril is more in the uncertainty and the creepiness of the whole situation, culminating not in feats of courage and daring do, but rather a philosophical question. Should the dogs take up the offer of eternal bliss? Or should they retain their blind loyalty to humans, even when Sirius warns them of the very real threat of global thermonuclear war? Pongo and the other characters must wrestle with these questions, and unlike in real life where this is just a hypothetical, they have to actually make a decision and live with the consequences. There's a lot to get into, so let's start with the political stuff, because somehow it's one of the lighter elements of this sequel to 101 Dalmatians. Now, you might be thinking, surely this is just you reading into this, why would anyone put political satire in their children's book about flying dogs? But no, we are introduced to 3 members of Cadpig's cabinet, 2 of which are named: Babs the Poodle, the Minister for Transport, and George the Boxer, the Foreign Secretary. When the Starlight Barking was published in 1967, the Labour Party was in government, and had been for a few years under Prime Minister Harold Wilson. The Foreign Secretary was George Brown, and the Transport Minister was Barbara Castle. These 2 dogs, by the way, are the only 2 new named characters introduced in the entire book, besides Sirius the Dog Star and Lucky's wife Gay. There are plenty of other new characters, but none have as many lines and only get referred to as the Jack Russell, or the cat's husband, and so on. So the political stuff is obviously deliberate, and more than that, targeted at the government of the time rather than just at politics in general, though there's plenty of amusing lines which apply as much today as they did 60 years ago. The other mentioned member of Cadpig's cabinet is the Chancellor, who is unnamed but presumably corresponds to James Callaghan, who was Chancellor from 1964 to 1967 and was later Prime Minister between 1976 and 1979. There's not as much about the Chancellor dog in the book, which is a shame. Having said that, the first instance of political commentary is a sick burn on the Chancellor and the government as a whole. The reason Cadpig became the Prime Minister's dog is because she went along to number 10 with Mr. Dearly when the government asked him, as a wizard of finance, to get them out of debt, but they're in so deep that even Mr. Dearly can't help them. Later on, when Pongo is introduced to the Chancellor dog, and Pongo's mathematical skills are praised, Pongo bashfully says that all he can do is put 2 and 2 together to make 4, to which the Chancellor dog replies that, with us, they've only been making 3. Unless you think he's referring just to the dog cabinet, he follows up with, but things may be better after the Chancellor's had this long restful sleep. James Callaghan gets off light, however, compared to George Brown and Barbara Castle. Brown was Foreign Secretary from August 1966 to March 1968. In doing research for this, it may surprise you to learn that all this is a bit before my time. The first line of one blog post caught my eye. If he is remembered for anything much nowadays, George Brown is remembered for his drinking. Given that this is from the days when being hammered in the House of Commons was so normalised that Churchill has a famous quote about it, you know this has to be especially bad for it to be recorded by history. The stories are endless. The most famous one that I kept finding, but sadly is not true, is that while at an official reception on a trip to South America, George Brown approached a scarlet-clad figure and asked them to dance, to which they replied, "There are 3 reasons, Mr. Brown, why I will not dance with you. The first, I fear, is that you've had too much to drink. The second is that this is not, as you suppose, a waltz that the orchestra is playing, but the Peruvian national anthem, for which you should be standing to attention. And the third reason why we may not dance, Mr. Brown, is that I am the Cardinal Archbishop of Lima." Again, not true, but it was too good not to tell you. Stuff that's more likely is a Labour politician describing the choice between Harold Wilson and George Brown in the 1963 Labour leadership election as a choice between a crook and a drunk. Brown apparently once tried to undo the back of Barbara Castle's blouse in the Commons. Castle recalled him rolling around sozzled. He loudly told the Belgian government that it was the British army who defended Europe, while the Belgian army spent their time in brothels. He slurred through a commemoration for JFK after his assassination, which led to the coining of the euphemistic term tired and emotional to explain drunkenness, and so on, and so on, and so on. The ultimate conclusion is that he was more often drunk than sober. By 1967, Brown's drunkenness was basically public knowledge, to the point where it was being lampooned by the private eye when it wasn't being censored. The Foreign Secretary dog in Starlight Barking is a plump, jovial boxer who careens around, knocking people over when swooshing, is always putting his paw in his mouth, according to Cadpig, selects the incompetent roly-poly, who Mrs. thinks he resembles, as his private secretary, turns up late to the cabinet meeting completely soaked, so ends up rolling around on the carpet, to which Cadpig admonishes him, "That's no way to behave at a cabinet meeting." He then vanishes from the story along with Roly-Poly while they fly off to France, unbeknownst to the other dogs. Cadpig assures Mrs. that George is quite the dog about town. Mrs. is far from sure that made things any safer. Roly-Poly just about makes it back from France in time at the end of the book, and remarks of his adventure, "You should have seen George with the French lady dogs. Ooh la la." So yeah, biting political satire about George Brown, though apparently he claimed not to be a womanizer, which Wikipedia at least believes. Though it should be noted that at the age of 68 he left his wife, who he'd been married to for 45 years, to shack up with his 33-year-old secretary. So do with that what you will. Dodie Smith then turns her fire on Barbara Castle, Minister of Transport from December 1965 to April 1968. Castle is a more famous name now than George Brown, and more fondly remembered as one of the most significant Labour politicians of all time. As Transport Minister, she oversaw the introduction of mandatory seatbelts, the 70-mile-an-hour national speed limit, and the breathalyzer, leading to an amusing private eye cover featuring, I think, George Brown, though it's hard to tell. Her dog depiction in Starlight Barking, however, satirises her supposed vanity. A story from Neil Kinnock described her as on the point of atomic detonation when her hairdresser failed to show up before a TV appearance, while Labour MP Roy Hattersley spoke of her weekly appointment with her hairdresser as an essential Friday engagement. In Castle's defence, of course, and in her own words, if you're a woman in the public eye, getting your hair nice is a constant preoccupation. This was the 60s after all, and while men could get away with looking like a spitting image puppet, women were held to higher standards, and would face more questions about their appearance and clothing, something which thankfully we in the modern era have long since moved past. Dodie Smith, though, does not pull her punches. depicting Castle as a prettily clipped brown poodle who will need a lot of help, what with the traffic and that top knot. Mrs. and Cadpig then have a short discussion about said top knot, which Mrs. disapproves of, and Cadpig notes she's been known to have it tied up with a very fancy ribbon, which is in place when she arrives at Trafalgar Square, where she also does a little dance with the Chancellor when they're all being thought controlled by Sirius, probably a deliberate joke since Castle and Callahan hated each other. There's also a couple of digs at Castle's competence. Cadpig thinks she will need two very intelligent private secretaries, Lucky and Gay, implying she's a bit fake, and it's even implied that she takes credit for something Pongo did. At one point, Pongo wishes for the traffic lights to start working, and they do, but then later Babs the Poodle says she did it. Pongo himself doubted at the time that he was a powerful enough wisher to get them to work, but this is probably over-modest given what Sirius says and what Pongo is capable of throughout the book. And that's just the political jokes about specific cabinet ministers. The satire keeps going and even morphs into commentary. On the vacuousness of the public, for example. Cadpig single-handedly propped up the Wilson government by showing lots of affection to him during a live broadcast, to which the British nation, with capital B and N, say, "Dogs always know." She then appears with him on television, smiling fetchingly at the end of his speeches, so that people don't switch off halfway through. As a result of this, most of the government buys dogs. Mrs. and Pongo advised that Wilson would be better off if he didn't talk on television, and instead sat there smiling kindly and saying nothing. And Mrs. later remarks that when politics comes on the telly, she closes her eyes and goes deaf. In a similar vein, the optics and empty words of politics are mocked. Cadpig called all the dogs to London without knowing her next step. Now she cannot send them home again because it will look bad for her and the PM. Pongo chairs a cabinet meeting where he issues his advice to wait and see, quoting a former famous prime minister, which all the dogs are very happy about and start chanting loudly with their thought waves. The irony, as Mrs. remembers, is that the wait and see maxim of David Lloyd George was considered very annoying and many people hadn't liked it. There's a few amusing lines, like Mrs. reflecting that she has learned what a cabinet is. It's a group of dogs. And that at one point Cadpig holds a cabinet meeting, but nobody can think of what to say, so they just pass a vote of confidence in themselves. All this political stuff went way over my head when I read this as a child, and it was interesting coming back to it and realising that all this was there. But there's more that's sort of related to the political commentary in a more nebulous way. So to discuss that, let's turn to Cruella de Vil, the fear of the unknown, and the madness of crowds. Starlight Barking is a fairly unique children's book in that it doesn't have a villain. It doesn't even really have an antagonist. Sirius is certainly a sinister force, and various dogs are suspicious of his motives and his promises, but in the end he honours their wishes, and his intentions are confirmed as relatively benign. He was just lonely and wanted some friends. Nor is the environment the main threat, as it was for much of the first book. The dogs are effectively removed from all worldly needs: food, water, shelter, transportation, and so on. Even the threat of mass panic is eliminated. What does that leave then as the threat for the first 3/4 of the narrative before Sirius makes his appearance? Well, it is twofold. The fear of the unknown, which leads to a search for an enemy to justify that fear. This starts early in the book, when Cadpig contacts Pongo and Mrs. I already quoted you Cadpig's offhanded line telling Pongo he may be placed in command of a private army, for which they need plenty of Dalmatians. This latter stipulation is never openly explained, but fits in well with the environment of undirected fear causing the dogs to retreat to their tribes. Cadpig's request does prompt a debate with Mrs., who asks why they need an army, since there is no one to fight. Cadpig responds that the enemy you don't know is worse than the enemy you do know. Mrs. counters that this is nonsense. The enemy you don't know isn't there. This sets up one of the themes of the book, the fear of the unknown leading to excessive overreaction, and finding enemies where there are none. This is explicitly linked with militarism, with Cadpig's request for an army immediately backed up by the general, who tells Pongo and Mrs. to choose good soldiers. Mrs. says, none of them are any kind of soldiers, they're just dogs. And do let's go on thinking of them as dogs, for as long as we can. Cue ominous end of chapter. This trend bubbles under the surface for much of the book, re-emerging in Pongo's musings that, I don't think I like things I don't understand, or the regular references to the dogs as an army, or the use of military-style commands like quick swoosh. The unfocused fear finds a target, however, when Mrs. notices a sign for Cruella de Vil's new business venture, plastic raincoats. Pongo tries to reassure her that Cruella is no longer their enemy, and she couldn't possibly have anything to do with what's going on. But Mrs. is unconvinced, pronouncing that we must warn Cadpig, she must have Cruella locked up, and that Cruella is not human. At this moment it's worth explicitly spelling out two things. The first is the Pongo misses dichotomy of fear of the unknown, and the second will be the clever way the reader is instinctively drawn to pick up their torch and pitchfork. To take the first one first, throughout the book a distinction is made between Pongo and Mrs.'s forms of intelligence. Pongo is brainy, while Mrs. has good instincts. The two dogs themselves, as well as Cadpig and even Sirius, remark on this. Yet both dogs are capable of succumbing to the fear of the unknown, even though both are smart enough to know better. We've already seen Mrs. rejecting Cadpig's proposal that they must fear what does not even exist, and her discomfort with the idea of a dog army. But once a specific form is given to the fear, that of Cruella de Vil, Mrs. will become one of the most enthusiastic of the lynch mob that we will move on to soon. Pongo is by contrast one of the few dogs to object to this, but as we have seen, he's more on Cadpig's wavelength with the military response, and he is himself unsure of whether Cruella could be to blame or not. His intelligence begins to justify unintelligent violence, as we will see shortly. The book thus refuses to give us a simple solution to avoid fear of the unknown. Neither serene intelligence nor instinctive understanding are immune. The second thing is the way the reader is drawn into this. Everything about the book is written in a way to get us to suspect Cruella is to blame. First is the meta situation, that if the villain of the first book features in the second, surely there are villains here as well. Then there is the way Cruella is discussed in the book. We find out early on that Cruella has returned to England after fleeing following the events of the first book. Pongo wonders, how could Cruella have anything to do with this mysterious sleeping? This after Mrs., who doesn't know Cruella has returned, exclaims, well, thank goodness this one can't have anything to do with Cruella de Vil. Anyone, including children, who has ever read a book, seen a film, or in any way consumed narrative media before, knows what this means. When the characters say something like, this cannot possibly be the case, that generally means it is. And again, Pongo continually repeats that Cruella cannot be involved, even as more dogs become convinced she is. And what would be the point of having Cruella in this story, the reader asks, if she is not involved in any way? She can't just be asleep, like everyone else. Even the blurb gets in on the act, on my edition anyway, asking, could Cruella de Vil be up to her old tricks again? And factor into all this that Cruella is a known horrific bloodthirsty Dalmatian skinner. We know how awful she is. So the reader is fully on board with the anti-Cruella movement. Pongo's speech in cabinet is an attempt to counter the fear of the unknown. He asks the dogs, is it not more exciting not to know what lies ahead? And he receives rapturous applause for his speech. But this doesn't stop a brewing schism in dogdom. For Cruella de Vil's old cat has awoken, and is heading to London with the General, Major Willow the tabby cat, his new lieutenant, a Jack Russell, and Tommy, a small child. The cat, referred to as the White Persian, apparently wants to go to the Dearlys' old house in Regent's Park. Pongo asks why, the General relates only that it's necessary. Mrs. thinks she knows why, a worrying reason, but she does not discuss it with Pongo. They visit the zoo, but Mrs. can't focus because of her secret thoughts and suspicions. So they head off to Regent's Park, but can't get in the house. The door won't open, unlike all the others that day. While Pongo is describing the house they used to live in, Mrs. draws aside the cats. The White Persian tells her that the real reason she wanted to come here was to see the Dearlys' old neighbour, Cruella de Vil. Mrs. says, I guessed you'd suspect her, and so do I. The Major says, she must be stopped. And this is where the White Persian chips in with, we must get into her house and, well, frighten her. And she meant much more than she said. Mrs. is in favour, and is about to tell Pongo when a Dalmatians' old ally, the Staffordshire Terrier, arrives, and he has the same suspicions, saying, if you want to attack the old puppy stealer, count on me. I told Pongo long ago that we ought to do her in. And suddenly, we're in the prospect of full-scale dog civil war. The General is sympathetic, so is Tommy, and the Jack Russell lieutenant is shouting, forward to kill Cruella de Vil. This is one of my favourite paragraphs in the whole book, by the way. I'm a sucker for bits in stories where the good guys are diametrically opposed on something, and one of them starts wondering how things would shake out if it comes to a fight. Lucky quietly telling Pongo that he and the Dalmatians will back him, Pongo thinking about how the Staffordshire and the sheepdog are formidable. I love this stuff. Anyway, the dogs enter Cruella's house and have a look around. Cruella has repainted the walls in violent colours forming angular shapes, and angular faces with horrid expressions. Pongo thinks they're all portraits of Cruella. The White Persian claws up a rug as practice. The Staffordshire remarks, I'd say you and I have the same idea, though you favour claws and I favour teeth. Pongo tells the Dalmatians not to hurt Cruella, again reiterating that she has nothing to do with what's happening. But Mrs. disagrees, and Pongo once again doubts himself. But when the brigade reach the DeVille's bedroom, the fight goes out of most of them when they see that the DeVilles, like all the other humans, are asleep. Only the Staffordshire is still in favour of killing her, and the White Persian who worries they've been too soft-hearted, with both pointing out that killing her in her sleep would be the best time to do it. Still, the dogs leave, and Cruella is barely mentioned for the rest of the book. It turns out that Mrs. was right the first time. The enemy they didn't know was the enemy that didn't even exist. She wonders why the door to the DeVilles' house was opened when they didn't actually need to go in. Pongo replies that we needed to know that we didn't need to. It would be easy to dismiss the Cruella DeVille episode as filler, a pointless side quest that leads to a dead end. But I think there's much more to it than that. The main villain of the previous book, and by far the most recognisable character from it, the 1961 Disney film had already made her a household name, haunts the narrative of the first half of the book, and provides a universal scapegoat for the animals and the reader to focus their nebulous fears upon. The revelation that she has nothing to do with the mysterious goings-on is a caution against jumping to conclusions and blaming people for things just because they are an easy target. Now that we're in the realm of moral questions and the instincts, hunches and ideas of the characters, we need to address arguably the creepiest aspect of the story. The fact that Sirius the Dog Star has mind control powers, and we can never be quite sure throughout the story whether the dogs are thinking things because they are thinking them, or if it is Sirius thinking for them. There's a few confirmed cases where Sirius puts thoughts into dogs' heads. One is when Pongo decides to turn on the TV, and he initially thinks the idea is his, born of a sudden need of television. Then there's the bliss brought on by Sirius, which begins with all of the dogs thinking about how special and clever they are, thoughts that are presented as their own, but which are obviously influenced by Sirius. This is then followed up by the dark side, where they are plunged into indescribable terror, which they are incapable of breaking out of, moving, or even speaking. Throughout the story, the characters are struck not only by the strangeness of the situation, but also how strangely all the dogs are acting. There is no panic, no resentment, no fighting, only mindless obedience. There's something off-putting about it, even within the story, remarked upon several times by the characters. It's a classic mind control / hive mind question, whether it is worth sacrificing individual identity for collective peace and happiness. The answer to this in stories is almost always no, and Starlight Barking is no different, though we'll come on to that later. The mind control expands to Sirius being able to read minds, which Mrs. disapproves of. After all, one's entitled to private thoughts. Sirius speaks with the voices of each dog's owner, appears differently to each dog, looking like a member of each given dog's breed. Pongo thinks about this in terms of the phrase being all things to all men, which generally means being insincere, though Pongo doesn't quite understand this as he remembers that it was originally about St. Paul. The creepiness of this whole thing is taken up another notch when you consider the question this inevitably raises. How do any of the dogs know which of their thoughts throughout the story are their own, and which are Sirius's? For example, does Pongo's consideration of the phrase all things to all men only get directed to the much nicer ground of St. Paul because Sirius is directing it there? Do the dogs want to kill Cruella because they want to, or because Sirius wants them to? Does Pongo doubt himself because those are his doubts, or did Sirius put them there? How about his discontent with his own life at the start of the book? Most damningly for Sirius, what about Pongo's sudden uncertainty about his instinct to reject Sirius in Trafalgar Square, which very much reads like outside meddling? But was he sure? He suddenly felt he wasn't sure of anything. He had begun to feel terribly confused, and he didn't know why. Shortly after, Pongo realizes why he feels so confused. He felt his mind was being invaded by the glorious, dazzling presence of Sirius. If only Sirius would let him think his thoughts for a little while. Naturally, Sirius reads Pongo's mind, and thus says that he will go off to give the dogs some peace and quiet. But is this only a further ploy? As his absence makes the dogs miss him terribly. Perhaps Sirius is making them miss him, either through malign influence or just knowing that they would. Pongo does consider this, that Sirius is tricking them in this way, when thousands of dogs bark that they feel lonely. Given Pongo's final decision, Sirius must be allowing him some freedom of choice, but how much is he subtly trying to weigh that choice towards the outcome he wants? And as for that outcome, let's turn to that for our final topic of discussion. And we'll start in a place you probably, even after all this weirdness, didn't expect a sequel to 101 Dalmatians to engage with. The terrifying threat of nuclear war. Sirius has been watching Earth for millions of years, and has always wanted to bring dogs to his star, but only now feels justified in doing so because, and I quote, "Soon, through human foolishness, there may be no Earth. or no Earth as you know it now. And those few of you who do survive will be desperate, starving wretches, fighting each other, eating each other, just in order to go on living a life that isn't worth living. Sirius calls on Cadpig to back up what he is saying. She acknowledges it. You mean that humans may someday destroy the Earth with terrible bombs? But Cadpig doesn't believe that will happen. After all, it doesn't make sense that humans would choose to blow themselves up just to win a fight. Sirius agrees that no one wants it to happen, but dogs and most humans won't get a say in it, and it might happen anyway. Once this home truth has been imparted, Sirius has another, when Cadpig asks, how could we leave our pets? If you don't recall, in both Dalmatian books the dogs think of humans as their pets, not their owners, which is also backed up by the omniscient narration. From the opening of 101 Dalmatians, the Dearlies believe that they own their dogs, instead of realising that their dogs own them. Pongo and Mrs. found this touching and amusing, and let their pets think it was true. Yet Sirius shatters this. You have no pets. You have owners. Dogs pretend otherwise, and some humans do too, but they know it isn't true, and you know it too. All this time, Sirius has been employing his powers of persuasion, using a coaxing Harold Wilson-esque tone at first, then dropping it for his dose of reality, cutting across Mrs.'s whispering by reminding her that there's no point, he can even read her thoughts, then back to flattery, praising many specific dogs and then every single dog breed and mixed breed. The point that Sirius is making is a fascinating one for this question because it cuts across the usual distinction that comes about when you ask characters to choose between their current existence and an idyllic utopian dreamland. The catch to the utopia is often, especially in stories which like this one were written during the height of the Cold War, a sacrifice of freedom. Sirius has this in spades. He can control thoughts, and that is how he proposes to bring eternal bliss to dogdom, and there is something of the collective hive mind in how the dogs experience this bliss. But characters choosing to die on their feet rather than live on their knees, or to have the freedom to make bad decisions and suffer accordingly, does not quite track here, because Sirius points out that the dogs do not have freedom in their current existence. They are leashed, bathed, forced to obey, beaten, starved, arrested. This is not freedom, so either choice they make involves submission to a higher power. And this is again reinforced when Sirius asks them to make the decision by a majority vote, and after a brief period of shouting, the dogs decide to let Pongo, Mrs. and Cadpig make the choice for them. All day they have told us what to do. Let them tell us now. As Cadpig noted earlier, some dogs just want to be led. And in a crowd like this, some dogs becomes all dogs. Whatever the triumvirate chooses, even if you could present the status quo as freedom, the dogs have en masse forfeited their freedom by giving free randomers the option to eliminate it. Pongo heads off to consider the matter with his closest advisors. At this point also, by the way, informing us that he does not think Cadpig's cabinet is especially bright, and goes to the National Gallery. A painting of a man on a horse startles Pongo, until he realises it's a painting. But here we get a classic in the hive mind bliss versus chaotic individualism debate. The art makes Pongo feel something. It is real in a way he can understand. Only Tommy and the cats make a decision, the former wanting to go and the latter two staying, which again suggests that maybe Sirius's mind control powers are at play, as no dogs are willing to make a decision of their own. They all begin abdicating responsibility. The cabinet will do whatever Cadpig does. Cadpig wants to stay but is willing to go if Pongo says so. Lucky and the Hell Hall Dalmatians will do whatever Pongo and Mrs. say. Mrs. will do whatever Pongo does. The lieutenant will go with the general will go with Tommy. The mathematics of the situation mean that the decision falls entirely on Pongo's shoulders. A single great man, or in this case great dog, deciding the fate of an entire species through his own individual will. Yet even he wishes for good advice, a wish which, unlike all the others granted by Sirius that day, does not come true. Or does it? Because as soon as Pongo wishes it, that the painted horse would come to life and give him advice, the Great Dane from the first book appears. And the Great Dane has some pretty insightful advice. They'll be fooled, all those dogs in Trafalgar Square, he had thought. Crowds are always fooled. He points out the changing into different dog breeds, the deliberate contrast of the bliss and darkness and light, and holds that Sirius is certainly a very clever trickster. And the Great Dane seems to have some pretty strong powers of persuasion himself, as Pongo starts to agree with him. And now we get yet another absolute classic of this genre, the arrival of the poorest, most desperate members of society. Here they take the form of three lost dogs, pitiful, scrawny, starved creatures. They claim to speak for all strays and abandoned dogs, who all feel as we do. Pongo invites them to speak, but his heart sinks, for surely these dogs must want to escape their unhappy lives on Earth. Indeed, they are deeply grateful for what Sirius has given them. Some had forgotten what it was like to not be hungry. But when Pongo supposes that they must all want to go with Sirius, they all say no, because always there is hope for us. They all want the chance at finding some humans who love them. Indeed, they loved even the humans who treated them unkindly and turned them out. Discarding the dog notion that they own humans, they say, we want our chance to belong to someone again. Pongo points out that they could belong to Sirius, but the dogs respond, that wouldn't count. Everyone would belong to him. We all want someone of our very own. As Pongo wonders if he can find the words, Sirius reads his mind, and the minds of all dogs across the world. And the answer is no. And he now knows that there could never have been another answer, for dogs are so devoted to mankind. Though I do not think such devotion is deserved, I can admire it. So the choice that the dogs end up making is not the kind of choice that most stories which pitch these two options against each other would have. Yes, they choose to reject the weird hive mind of higher power promising eternal happiness, but they do it not out of love of freedom, but out of love of subjugation. They choose their existing masters over a new one, even though that new one is probably better by most reckonings. It's a kind of exploration of this philosophical question that works well with dogs, which are known for being blindly loyal and having unconditional love for their owners. Even the lost dogs would rather have a chance of being owned by a human, even a bad one, than the guarantee of being happy with Sirius. The last few pages of the book are mostly taken up by logistics, getting everything back to where it needs to be. There's still time for a couple of philosophically relevant developments though. Roly-Poly is still missing, so Pongo makes a decision to leave without him, as he has to do what's best for the group at the expense of an individual. This also involves the rather grim manipulation of Mrs. to make sure she doesn't notice what's going on, effectively removing her agency in the decision about abandoning their son. Of course, it's a children's book, so Roly-Poly's alright in the end, thanks to Sirius, but still. Then, when they're settling down in their beds at the very end, Mrs. displays both her intellectual failings and her instinctive insightfulness, as has been her role for the whole book. She declares that Sirius was able to speak to all the dogs in different places at the same time, because in space there are no clocks, and where there are no clocks, there is no time. Besides, it was all done by magic, though there's a new word for magic, metaphysical. After this, she then makes the observation that essentially life without pain has no meaning. Because she is hungry, so now she can look forward to breakfast. She hasn't missed food the whole day because of Sirius's mind control, but she has missed missing it. Indeed, earlier, when she had been offered a peppermint cream but hadn't wanted it, what she longed for was for the longing of a peppermint cream, not the peppermint cream itself. With bliss, there's always a catch. After a while, you wouldn't notice it. Some of these elements of which I've spoken are present in 101 Dalmatians, but much less and much different. Mr. Daly, for example, is described as having made enough money to house all these Dalmatians by using his financial wizardry to bail the government out of their debt, but it's not quite as dire as the second book, and the satire is nowhere near as pointed, or as cynical. There are several instances of murderous ideation in the first book, and certainly Cruella is hateable enough that the reader wouldn't mind if the Dalmatians did a Ramsay Bolton on her and the Band Brothers, but the dogs don't come nearly as close to doing the deed as they do in Starlight Barking. The army theme is as strong, if not stronger, in the first book. There is of course the General and the Major, who at that point are mere Colonel and Lieutenant before their promotions, while the Dalmatians are described as an army and are trained with military discipline. Lucky even gets promoted from corporal to sergeant major to lieutenant, all in the span of an evening. But it doesn't have the same undertones as when Cadpig is forming a private army of her own breed out of fear of the unknown. And even that slightly odd specification of Dalmatian supremacy is one that is addressed and rejected in 101 Dalmatians. Patch's deformity, from which he gets his name, makes him less valuable as a commodity but no less valuable as a person. And Dodie Smith scolds the humans who would drown pups for not being purebred enough. Yet in Starlight Barking, even the Dearlys seem to have succumbed to this foolish purism, as Patch learns that he should not marry for the good of his breed, and Sirius scornfully lays bare the human distaste for mongrels when pointing out how abusive and unworthy of dogs' loyalty they are. Starlight Barking feels like a harsher world than 101 Dalmatians. Even though all their earthly needs are taken care of throughout the book, what the dogs lack in the sequel is something deeper. Cadpig's private army, the lynch mob to kill a defenseless Cruella, the political wrangling and the acknowledgement of impending nuclear apocalypse. The book overall feels colder, crueler. In this book, when I see that Cruella's new venture, Clothes That Clank, is spelt clothes that clank, with KL at the start of the words, and I recall that she fled England for a few years to somewhere, and I consider the time this was written, the 1960s. I wonder for a split second if... But no, surely that isn't a reference to... If it is, of course, it's very much anti. Besides Cruella being involved, Smith delivers what would be a sick burn in noting that Mrs. can only understand the clanification because she can't spell properly. But my point is that such a thought wouldn't cross your mind when reading 101 Dalmatians. But even without considering any of that, this book is just strange. I think what fascinates me about it is how something like this just doesn't really get made anymore. Perhaps the best proof of that is Disney's repeated overlooking of this sequel when milking the Dalmatians franchise for all it's worth. It's just too weird, and way too different from the first book in genre. This book was written at a time when authors could just decide, 8 years after a bestseller, to knock out an impromptu genre-switching novel of ideas sequel. You don't see 2-book series often. Usually if it happens it's because the author wanted to write a third but died before they could, or just didn't get around to it, or because the second book failed commercially. Neither is true in this case. Dodie Smith lived until 1990 and wrote 3 novels after Starlight Barking, with the last published in 1978, and wrote 4 volumes of an autobiography between 1974 and 1985. And the book was successful enough that it remains in print to this day. Dodie Smith clearly just didn't feel the need to write another. But that's another way that this book would not be the same today, even if someone did write it. Because information on why Smith chose to write this is pretty much nowhere to be found. If any interviews with her at the time of publication survive, they're not on the internet. Her autobiography only covered her life up to 1953, so before even 101 Dalmatians was published. Though a 5th volume was apparently planned, it was never written. The strangeness of the book and what I've taken from it has been laid out to you in this video, but as to what the author herself thought about the whole thing, I'm ignorant. Someone somewhere presumably knows. If you are one of those people, please do leave a comment. But if, like me, you find the lack of context for the strange phenomenon that is the Starlight Barking somewhat enjoyable, you may want to avoid reading such a comment. This book is a children's book, of course. There is some stuff for adults, the political stuff, and there's a few jokes that made me chuckle. But I first read it as a child and had not read it since until I decided to make this video. But the book stayed with me. Not for the political satire, which I obviously didn't get, or even really the philosophical question, which, if it had any effect on me, it was subconscious. I remember it because it was so strange, so odd, like a dream with people and places you recognise in bizarre circumstances. And like a dream, as you wake up, you wonder, was that really real? Did Pongo and Mrs. and the rest really talk to the dog star, which is actually a dog? I'm happy to report that yes, they did.